Hello and welcome to the second episode of Reuters Events Zeroing In series, a new series designed to explore the big themes, key debates and challenges facing us as we move through this energy transition. My name's Owen, I lead the energy transition team here at Reuters Events and will be your chair today. Thank you all of you for joining us today and those also now listening on demand. The first episode, the second episode I should say, will explore deep decarbonisation and the industry transition. As ever, this is very much an interactive discussion, so please do get your questions coming in and we'll see how many we can get to as we move through. Joining me today to explore these themes, I have the pleasure of introducing the Right Honourable Lord Barker of Battle, Executive Chairman of N+ Group, and Faustine de la Salle, Co-Executive Director of the Mission Possible Partnership and Director at the Energy Transition Commission. Thank you both for joining us.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
Faustine, let's come to you first. I'd like to ask, perhaps to set the scene for us here, what is this industry transition that we talk about, and is it possible? Are you optimistic?
I'll start with what's required. I think what all IPCC reports have shown lately is that if we want to have a chance of maintaining the rise in temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius by mid-century and end of century, we really need to do two things at the same time. We need to bring all of the emissions from the energy industry, transport, building sectors as close as possible to net zero by 2050. And we also need the food and land use system to become a net negative in terms of emissions, whereas today it is producing emissions, both because of agriculture and because of emissions from deforestation. So those two things need to happen at the same time. And it also means that by 2030, we already need to decrease the emissions from the energy and industry system very significantly if we want to be on track to our 2050 objectives and if we don't want to overshoot in terms of emissions. So that's really the objective. Now, the good news, I think, is that technically, and from a macroeconomic point of view, this is definitely feasible. The work that we've done with the Energy Transitions Commission over the past few years has led us to really strongly believe that we have all of the technologies we need to do that. They might not all be commercially available yet. They might not all be cost competitive yet, but there's no area of that transition for which we don't have any solution. And indeed, generally, we have several solutions and a portfolio of solutions applicable in different sectors. There are broadly three types of things we need to do. We need to reduce demand for energy, and so reduce demand for energy intensive products and services by just doing things more smartly, sharing cars, for instance, or rethinking our urban planning. We also need to improve the energy efficiency of our processes. So in industry, it's just using less energy to produce the same ton of steel. And then we need to shift to zero carbon technologies. And I can come back later if of interest to what type of technologies might those be. So overall, I think it's feasible, which makes me optimistic. What makes me less optimistic is the pace at which we're moving today. And the fact that we start seeing the climate breakdown. Some of the climate feedback loops that we were all fearing are starting to happen. And so we're really pressed on time to make that transition happen. And for that to happen, we need all stakeholders to work together, policymakers, industry players, finance players. And that collaboration is starting, but it's not going fast enough for us to keep on track with what we need to achieve.
That's great, and for sure we'll come back to some of those points you mentioned around demand, efficiency, and technology as well. Just before we move on, I'd like to hear a bit more around the role that the Mission Possible Partnership plays within that, and for those tuned in less familiar, can you just talk to us about what you're doing there?
Yes, absolutely. So the Mission Possible Partnership was officially launched just a few months ago, so I wouldn't take it against any of our audience if they hadn't heard about it. It's a partnership that really is built on the idea that climate action until now has happened on a national basis. We have the Paris Agreement, which is a combination of nationally determined contributions, but the reality is that the economy goes across boundaries. The aluminium industry, the steel industry, aviation, shipping, all of those are international sectors. So we also need to have a sectoral approach to climate action and to work with entire value chains to coordinate across those value chains to really accelerate the decarbonization of particular sectors. And so the Mission Possible partnership has been built to focus on the harder to abate sectors of the economy, in industry and in transport. And it's been built to bring together the stakeholders from across the value chain who want to reach net zero emissions and who want to collaborate to reach net zero emissions. Because the reality is that in the very complex economy in which we're living, the industry will only decarbonize if the value chain helps. It takes a whole value chain to decarbonize an industry.
Absolutely, sounds exciting, and I'm sure we'll continue to watch it as it develops. Lord Barker, I'd like to bring you in here. Greg, thank you for joining us. Of course, you have a unique perspective given your past roles in UK government, but also now working at both a aluminium producer and on the hydropower side as well. Can you talk to us a little bit more around kind of your approach to decarbonisation?
Yes, sure. Great to be with you, and also delighted to be sharing a platform with Faustine, who is not just a cheerleader for climate action or a commentator on climate action, but is actually one of the people that's actually up there driving solutions, doing the really hard work of actually explaining and then operationalizing what the energy transition, what the climate transition to a net zero economy actually has to do and be. So great to be with Faustine. But at N+, yes, you're right. We are a big player in all this, big because we are the largest producer of aluminium outside of China globally, and we're the world's largest producer of low carbon aluminium. And aluminium is one of the 7 hard to abate sectors that's been identified as absolutely critical if the world is going to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. If we don't play our part in decarbonising, then the hard efforts of other sectors and other countries will be undermined. So it's really important that our sector as a whole play its part. We are a very historically energy intensive, carbon polluting business. However, aluminium is actually a metal that is essential to the low carbon transition because it's in increasing demand for electric vehicles, for renewable energy. 85% of a solar panel is actually made up of aluminium. It's used for electricity infrastructure, increasingly replacing copper. It's used for packaging. Something like this is actually is what they call aluminium 2.0. It's replacing one-time plastics, particularly. So there's a whole multitude of uses, not just because it's super lightweight or has great conductivity, but also because it's almost infinitely recyclable. One boring statistic, about over 75% of all the aluminium that's been produced in the modern industrial era is still in use, still in circulation. So it's been part of the circular economy before anyone ever thought of that term. But given the growing demand for aluminium, we've got to find ways to make it in environmentally sensitive and sustainable ways. So we are on a mission to decarbonize ourselves and hopefully increasingly partnering with others in our industry to decarbonize the sector. We do start at N+ with a huge advantage because most of the world's aluminium, particularly from China, is produced using a huge amount of electricity that's typically come from coal-fired generation. And if you use coal for electricity in that process, it can take up to 18 tons of carbon to produce just 1 ton of aluminium. However, we are not just one of the world's largest producers of aluminium, we're also the world's largest private sector hydro company, one of the biggest clean energy companies in the world, because we have about 16 gigawatts of electricity coming from our dams on Lake Baikal. To put that in some sort of context, the Hoover Dam is 2 gigawatts, and 16 gigawatts is greater than all of the electricity output of Great Britain's nuclear reactors put together. So this is a huge resource of clean energy, and the largest part of which goes to make our aluminium. But even then, the carbon footprint is about 2.5 tons. So we've got to really bear down on the actual industrial process itself, from mining the bauxite, transporting it right the way across the world, from whether that's from the Caribbean or Africa, to the refinery where it's made into alumina in Europe, and then to the smelting plants itself. And there's no silver bullet to that. There are some exciting technologies, and what we've done is set ourselves a net zero goal. So we became in January the first company to declare in our sector to adopt that net zero goal. But we've also adopted, crucially, a really ambitious 2030 goal. Although we're already much lower in our carbon footprint than most of the rest of the sector, we've adopted a 35% reduction in GHGs by 2030. And I think the real message I would say is that having a net zero 2050 goal is meaningless unless you've got a really stretching and ambitious near-term goal for this decade. You've got to have decadal action. And it's not going to be easy. But as Faustine said, the technologies do exist, but we've got to really work hard, invest and collaborate in order to produce aluminium from these new technologies at the scale that's required, at the consistent quality that's required, and then ultimately at the price that the consumer will pay. So those are the three, scale, quality and price are the three big challenges. If we can get those right, everything else is easy.
Good to hear, and absolutely want to come back to that 35% and maybe dig into that a little bit later. But Faustine, just to pick up on something you mentioned, and I think, Greg, you've also touched on, is that need for acceleration and potentially those technologies around it that can really drive this forward. Faustine, how do we accelerate this industry transition? Is there a silver bullet, or is it that price, scale, quality that Greg talks about?
There is no silver bullet, unfortunately. So let's get that idea out of the discussion. I think what really is required is to bring a whole set of new technologies to a cost competitive point. And we know that a number of those technologies will see their cost reduce if we reach scale. So the very immediate challenge, I think, for the industry sectors is to bring a new set of zero carbon technologies to a critical scale that will actually unlock cost reduction and make production through that zero carbon fashion, zero carbon processes, more and more cost competitive and easier to do with just pure market economics. The critical question is, how do you get to that minimum scale, despite the fact that currently those technologies are more costly? And so that's where I think, coming back to what I was saying earlier, you really need a full value chain to get to that point, because you will need to create the business case for investment in a challenging economic environment. And so you'll need to have first inputs from the energy providers. And Greg was saying it right now, one of the critical dimensions of the economics of a product is how much you pay for your energy input. So we need to make the low carbon energy, zero carbon energy, much more cost competitive for industry players to leverage. The good news on that front, obviously, is that renewables have gone through a very sharp cost decrease over the past 10, 15 years and are now cost competitive in a number of markets against high carbon electricity, so that access to low carbon, cheap electricity is becoming a major advantage for industries who can leverage that either directly in the form of electricity or indirectly in the form of hydrogen. The other key thing that you need to do is ensure that that cost premium that still remains between your high carbon product and your low carbon product is absorbed by the market, and it can be absorbed in different ways. Obviously, policy has a big role to play to compensate for some of that difference until it slowly reduces and disappears in the same way as it has done for renewables. But consumers can also have a role to play, because what looks like a very big cost for a steel manufacturer, for instance, the cost differential between your high carbon steel and your low carbon steel might be a 50% difference at this point in time. But actually, when you run that through all the way to the end of your value chain, in terms of what additional cost it represents, for instance, for a consumer to buy a car that would be produced with zero carbon steel and zero carbon aluminium, it wouldn't add much more than 1 to 2% to the price of your car. So creating that ability to pass through the green premium all the way to the end consumer is actually also a very good way to help the industry players sell a product that does cost much more to them, but won't cost much more to the end consumer. So it's that combination of forces between the industry players themselves, their energy providers, policymakers, and buyers and consumers that can really create a business case for investment in those sectors. And if we have a business case, then I have no doubt that finance will flow. Finance players will sense that this is a good thing to invest in. But that collaboration across the value chain is typically what we're trying to build up through the work of the Mission Possible Partnership.
That's super interesting, and I think that kind of coming together of technology and policy, as well as something that we've seen with much of the renewables rollout, and as you mentioned, the energy transition. So learning those lessons, if you will, and kind of putting them across into the wider manufacturing industry is going to be important. Perhaps, Greg, I'll come to you on that policy point that Faustine mentioned, given kind of your history. What policies do you think could be in place on either a national or international level to help drive this forward, or are there other factors that you feel more important?
Well, policy is absolutely crucial to all of this. But going back 10 years, when I was first a minister in David Cameron's government, there were certain mantras that everyone subscribed to, such as emissions trading, that everyone thought that, no matter whatever the question, the answer was invariably emissions trading at some point will cover this all. And what being in government and now in business taught me is I don't think there is one universal silver bullet, that actually we've got to press all the buttons on the dashboard and then invent some more. So in terms of policy, I think we do have to have a higher level of ambition, but be quite pragmatic in how that's executed, depending on which particular market or country you're in. So we certainly need to drive everything towards putting a price on carbon. That's absolutely key. And I believe that certainly it's not going to be green premiums that are more expensive. I think ultimately it's going to be green premiums will set the benchmark for pricing of products and commodities, and then basically high carbon products will trade at a substantial discount or will carry a significant financial penalty and will just become uncompetitive. But that can find expression through a number of ways, whether that's emissions trading, whether that's a carbon tax, whether that's a border adjustment tax for carbon, but also regulation. I mean, if you look at California, one of the places that I was a big fan of 10 years ago as a pioneer state for policy making, it was their emissions performance standards, both for power generation, but also emissions performance for cars, that regulated emissions out of the system or regulated emissions down, rather than a financial penalty per se, although it often expressed itself ultimately in a cost. So I think there are lots of different ways you can do that, but one of the most powerful now I see is procurement, that all the way down the value chain is that manufacturers ultimately responding to their end customer are saying, we have our own net zero commitments now, and we are going to only procure green or low carbon products, and we're going to squeeze out the high carbon products from our own supply chain. Which is why if I were a Chinese aluminium business with 18 tons of carbon for every ton of aluminium that I made, I would be very worried about sitting on stranded assets, not in 2 decades time, but in a couple of years time, because it's very, very clear that this transition to a low carbon economy is happening way quicker than people were expecting even a couple of years ago. And what's more, the market, the financial markets are pricing this in today. They're looking forward to 2030 and they're projecting 2030 values, and they're pricing them into today. So this is happening much quicker. There are a range of policy tools, but we need all of them, and there's absolutely no room for any politician to be complacent.
So absolutely. I've got a question actually that's come in as you were speaking there as well, Greg, asking us to dig into this supply chain kind of conversation a little bit more, and a lot of people agreeing with the points that you raised there. Faustine, the question asked specifically though, when we're looking at that 50% premium, how in the supply chain do we get to that 1 to 2% for consumers? Where's the missing percentages, and how do you see them being kind of broken across that chain?
It's not a missing percentage. It's actually that in the cost of your final product, take a car, a lot of that cost is actually intellectual property, design, innovations in some kind of systems of how you run your car. The cost of the materials themselves in your final price is really tiny. So that 50% increase on your cost of steel, even if you pass all of that to your consumer, on the cost of your final product actually is very small, because your cost of steel in your price was already very small, and that small increase translates in not much more in terms of your cost of final product. It's the same thing if you think about shipping. The shipping costs themselves for companies who trade and move goods around the world can be very significant. But if you look at the cost of transport and logistics in the price of goods, be those, I don't know, shoes or IT materials, whatever, that you're buying yourself as a consumer, the price of your shipping around those goods is a very tiny proportion of the price you're paying for that product. So even if that tiny proportion was to double, it doesn't make much difference to the cost that you pay, the price that you pay as a consumer. And that's a really powerful leverage to help industry players have a business case and be able to pass on that cost premium. And as Greg said, at a point in time, that cost premium will disappear. We can be very confident of that, given all the cost trajectories that we've observed across all innovations in the world across sectors. So the reason why those low carbon products are higher priced today is not because by nature they will always be higher priced. It's because the technologies we need to produce them have never been operated on a commercial scale, and therefore have never reached economies of scale. So it's also a transitional cost increase that we need to absorb. It won't last forever.
Makes sense, and thanks for kind of clearing that up for us. Let's move on then, and we've looked so far at the need to accelerate and kind of some of the factors there, but to move more into the how-to, Greg, perhaps we'll come to you first. We mentioned that 35% reduction target that you have for 2030, and important as it is. How do you plan to get there, and what steps are you taking at the moment to ensure that you do deliver on that 2030 objective?
Well, there are lots of little things, and then there are 1 or 2 big things, and you can't ignore either of them. So first of all, it's investing in the ongoing efficiency of our business. So for example, we are have been replacing all of the big turbines in our hydro plants, the result of which has been to materially increase the efficiency of those plants and to drive up the output from effectively the same assets. And that's had a very positive impact both on our P&L, but also in terms of carbon emission savings. We're going to have to introduce carbon-free clean energy right the way across our value chain. At the moment, it's focused on the smelter, but we've got to go right the way through, squeezing it out, introducing decentralized renewables, of which I've always been a great fan, even in sort of very remote locations where we're mining or where we're refining. So and again, bringing in more efficiency and modernizing and upgrading our asset base. But then there are some, what you might call the grand challenges. And for us, the grand challenge is, how do you take the smelting process that sits at the very heart of producing aluminium and take away the emissions that don't just come from the energy inputs, but actually from the very chemical process that takes place at smelting. At the moment, that accounts for around 2.5 tons of carbon for every ton of aluminium we produce. But we are working on a thing called an inert anode, which instead in the baking process, if I can put it like that, is that rather than giving off CO2, you would actually give off oxygen as a byproduct. So you would actually end up with more oxygen being produced and released into the atmosphere than you started with. And this is really exciting. And if we can get to the scale, price and quality that I mentioned at the beginning, because we're already, as Faustine said, we're already able to produce these in several tons of this. If we can scale up and get the quality, that is a massive game changer. So it's doing lots of little things, but really having that one or two of those big grand challenges. And then I think, down the line, if I could look forward a decade, if we become the global masters of that technology, we're not going to keep it to ourselves. We will be sharing that with partners around the globe, and we will effectively, you could see big manufacturing companies like ours, even becoming, technology companies, licensing that technology, sharing it around the globe because the whole industry has to shift to a low carbon model. But there's a lot to do on the R&D front before we get to that point.
Sure. No, and I think those sentiments around kind of ultimately we don't get there unless we all get there when we talk about these targets. Faustine, within that context, then how can we foster greater collaboration to not only kind of move these technologies forward, but also help with those scale, price and quality points that Greg mentions?
It's a tricky question because you can sense that on those purely technological questions, obviously everyone has an interest in getting those technologies to market, but each company also has an interest in protecting their IP in bringing those technologies to market, at least for the first 5-10 years. So collaboration on technology is, I think, probably the most difficult dimension to get going, and a bit of competition there isn't bad because it just encourages several companies to go as fast as possible to beat their competitors. So on that front, I'm okay. I think it does take a different form of collaboration because most of those new technologies we need to bring to market require the expertise of the industry player, and they require the expertise of the energy provider. In some sectors, like in aluminium, EN Plus does both energy and industry, so it's probably in an ideal setup to get those technologies right. In other sectors, I'm thinking steel or cement, for instance, that connection between the energy player and the industry player wasn't that deep historically. And so what you have seen by now is a number of new partnerships shaping up that involve feedstock provider, energy provider, and industry player Typical example would be Hybrid in Sweden, that links up a steel manufacturer, an iron ore producer, and an energy provider to get the technology around hydrogen reduction of iron right. What I think is a much more productive space for collaboration then is really that question of how do you create a favorable environment for investment, because that's much less IP protected, and it is also absolutely critical for all companies who want to progress in their decarbonization. So what we're focusing on is really triggering collaboration on how do we get the policies right. How do we get the buyers to really scale up their demand for green products? And how do we exchange and interact and interface with the finance players? Because the finance community is also, has set up a number of net zero targets. They are putting pressure on their portfolio for companies in their portfolio to also get their decarbonization strategies right. They can be very powerful supporters of those transitions if we get the right financial mechanisms in place and if we get the right insurance mechanisms in place. So that dialogue between industry and finance players is also really important to accelerate investment. And that's, I think, a very fruitful space for collaboration.
Thank you. Greg, is there anything you'd add there? I think Faustine raises a good point around, that 16 gigawatts of power that you have, but that is not necessarily echoed across other organizations. So is there anything that you're doing, with others on that collaborative front to, in the spirit of today, with those IP issues in mind, to, as I say, kind of create that investment environment and drive greater collaboration?
Well, you're right. I mean, ultimately, replacing the energy source is not a challenge. The technology is absolutely there, and it is cost competitive. The reality is there may be, particularly in China, large industrial facilities that are plugged into a grid that's powered by coal. But if they can't replace that with low carbon intensity or clean electricity, they're just going to have to close the plant. There is a choice there, but I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that this low carbon transition can be done ultimately without there being big shakeout along the way. That is coming, and the faster it goes, the more it's going to happen. So there will be winners, there will be losers. What we want to do is make sure that we do this in a socially responsible way, so that the social consequences of any change are taken care of, and that that's when you look at ESG, it's not just environmental, it's also social and governance. And so we do have to that's why it is important to look at this in totality and what the impact on people is. But we do have to be realistic that there will be winners and losers in the transition, as there has been throughout economic history, and when you've seen industries rise and fall and technology drive innovation drive technological change. I have to say, in my sector, in the aluminium sector, we don't see great collaboration. I would like to see more. One of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, I think it's number 17, is actually greater collaboration, and we need to see that. And as well as collaboration, we need greater transparency in the aluminium sector. We need greater transparency and honesty about the carbon footprint of the product, because if you don't measure it, you can't manage it, and people can't make responsible purchasing decisions if they don't know the true carbon footprint of the product they're buying, whether that's aluminium foil or whether that's an electric vehicle. So we do need to see, as a first instance, for not just greater collaboration, but greater transparency and reporting of carbon in our industry as a first step towards that real shift change. Changing the energy source is easy, but where the collaboration will be needed is on the much more challenging scientific transition in the smelters and in the refineries, particularly where you've got heat involved.
Thank you for picking up on those things as well. on that point of transparency then, and if we look towards your 2030 target, how will we be expecting to see N+ kind of benchmark along the way? How does that roadmap look for you?
Well, we announced our targets, our net zero 2050 and our 2030 target in January. And we announced at that point that having gone public with it, that we would be consulting with our whole value chain and supply chain over the next 6 months, and that we will be publishing a roadmap in the autumn ahead of COP26. So I can't really give you the specifics without sort of leaking our report. And the honest answer is we've still got a lot more work to do it. But setting targets isn't credible unless they are driving action now, and unless you've got a credible plan or roadmap to do that. But we're under no illusion that this will require, not overnight, not next year, not the year after necessarily, but over the next decade or more, very substantial capex, a shift in the way that we invest as well as the absolute amount that we invest, and a relentless focus on innovation, research and development. And hopefully when we publish our roadmap in September, we'll be able to share more broadly exactly what that means.
Yeah, brilliant. We look forward to autumn and appreciate your honesty on that as well. Some few questions coming in actually on a conversation we began to look at earlier around technology. Hydrogen, of course, comes up in almost all sessions and discussions we have at the moment. Faustine, you mentioned around technologies that are available now, technologies that you see becoming available. Whilst there may not be a silver bullet, what does the landscape look like? What do you feel holds most potential?
So there's no silver bullet, but there is a major solution, which is electricity. Now that we are confident that we can get cheap, low carbon, zero carbon electricity across the globe in very large volumes, electrifying as much of the economy as possible is just the major thing to do. It will require massive increase in the size of the power system. Our own assumptions and calculations tell us that it's probably a quadrupling of the power system globally that we need to achieve over the next 30 years. And it is feasible if you look at the pace at which this can happen. We actually are about to publish a report on the subject that shows how you can do that in an incremental way, in a way that is coherent in terms of value chain development. But this is really the biggest thing to do. Then there are a range of sectors in the harder to abate sectors of the economy. If you think shipping, aviation, steel or cement, those sectors do not necessarily have the technologies yet to be electrified. So we need to look at other solutions for those sectors. And those other solutions generally fall into 3 categories. It's either hydrogen, which in itself is very often a derivative of electricity, or the use of biomass. But there is a big question mark around how much biomass will really be available for the energy system to use, and that can be produced in a sustainable way, because the big risk is for a number of sectors to turn to biomass and that to lead to deforestation, which is the last thing we want. So we need to be very cautious about that use of biomass. And then the final option is carbon capture. Combined with storage or with use cases that really capture the carbon for a long period of time, like cement and concrete, for instance. So we can propose those different technologies. They will be relevant in different sectors and in different geographies. A geography that has a lot of carbon storage sites, let's take Northern Europe, for instance, might want to prefer carbon capture solutions. A location, let's take Australia or Chile, that has ideal situation to produce loads of renewables and therefore lots of clean hydrogen, might go the hydrogen way rather than the carbon capture way. So again, no single silver bullet. But electricity for me is really where we should put a lot of effort at this point in time, because it can solve 60-70% of our energy system by 2050.
Greg, the same question really around that technology piece.
Well, I have to say, as the former energy minister, I completely agree with Faustine about the imperative of driving up the use of electricity generated from clean sources. I think it's also right to point out the increased localization of grids and generation, and the different applicability depending on the region. So, for example, on the face of it, you would think that we had huge potential to generate hydrogen. We've got certainly more potential to generate greater electricity from our 16 gigawatts of hydro on Lake Baikal. But the reality is, while we could create hydrogen as a byproduct, if we had to build new hydro plants just for hydrogen, that would be very expensive, and that's before you've even had to transport it. If you then had to create a pipeline network to take it a couple of thousand miles to market, the embedded cost of that would be huge, even though the actual active generation of hydro would not be very expensive. All of the infrastructure around it and required to transport it would be prohibitive. So I think hydrogen is going to be absolutely vital, particularly for industrial uses, but it's going to be generated locally, often as a byproduct of intermittent renewables, which are generating electricity at the time when there isn't necessarily full demand for it. So I think we've got to invest much more in very interactive, more localized grids that can be much more flexible and have localized storage facilities, whether that's to balance the grid or whether that's to generate hydrogen, particularly for industrial uses.
Thank you. I'm aware of time and that we are coming close to the end, but a question has come in which I think wraps this up quite nicely. And we've talked about acceleration, we've talked about the price, scale and quality, and also policy and technology within that. Ultimately, I think there's a feeling that really it's time to get proactive, and we do need to get going. So, Faustine, maybe to begin with you, how can industry leaders get more proactive and really drive this forward? What would your advice be?
Joint Mission Possible partnership. No, more seriously, I think it really takes leadership from the CEOs around this world and the chairmen of boards of major companies around this world to step up and agree to move even in an environment of uncertainty. Because I think the big characteristic of what's in front of us is that we know the direction, but none of us can be certain about the pace of change and about the exact set of technology mix that will end up winning the market. As Greg said, there will be winners and losers, but we need leaders who are ready to take risks and who are ready to step up to take their chance in those new markets and try and drive their companies in that direction, and to do that in collaboration with others, in particular in collaboration with their suppliers and with their buyers, because if they want to win, they will need to do it with their value chain. And that's really, I think, what we need at this point in time. More than technology, more than investment, or at least as the prerequisite for technology development, the prerequisite for investment is personal leadership from the CEOs of this world.
Thank you, Faustine, and same question, Greg.
Well, I agree. We've got to grab this. And I think what's interesting is that it's dawning now very rapidly on CEOs around this world that the risk of inaction to shareholder value, the risk of just doing nothing, just sticking to the status quo, is actually greater and more damaging to their corporate prospects than taking a chance on a technology or taking a chance to change their business model to a more low carbon way of doing things. And it's surprising just how quickly, as someone that's been banging on about this for, nearly 2 decades, that suddenly we have reached that inflection point. I'm absolutely certain. And I think there's going to be a clamoring, as you often see, a herd stampede. It's very difficult, as Faustine said, to say exactly what the timeline is going to be, but the momentum now behind low carbon growth is huge.
Great, and an optimistic note to end on as we started as well. So that's good, but unfortunately is all we have time for. Thank you, Greg, and to Faustine for joining us. Of course, all the recordings will be sent out, and in a couple of weeks' time, we'll be back for the next episode, which will explore the so-called green recovery and ask if enough is being done. Until then, thank you again to Faustine, and thank you to Greg. Thank you to everyone tuning in today. And we hope to see you all again soon, albeit virtually, very soon.
Thanks
very much.